Is Mary Ward Hall at San Francisco State University haunted? According to some students, it is. In a December 2012 edition of the Golden Gate Express, it was revealed that ghost hunters had descended on the campus in hopes of making contact with otherworldly entities said to haunt a certain third-floor dorm room. Journalist Charlotte Bodestein spoke with Alejandro Adam, who at the time was living in the infamous dorm room. He had heard the stories of the haunting, but had never personally experienced anything. The first week people were telling me, it's haunted, but I haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary. I feel normal in there, he told Bodestein. Alejandro, who was double majoring in international relations and French, thought the whole thing quite ridiculous. I think it's silly, but cool at the same time. My room's popular. It makes me feel special, he said. The haunting was said to have begun more than 20 years ago following the tragic murder-suicide of a pair of students in the third-floor room. On the afternoon of March 7, 1994, 21-year-old Catherine Ann Copeland called her parents in Ventura to tell them that she had received an airline ticket and was going to be flying home for Easter. Later that day, Copeland's 22-year-old ex-boyfriend, Eric Michael Jones, knocked on her dorm room door. By 9:15 p.m., both would be dead. Students in the dorm room heard gunshots and called campus police, who used a master key to enter Copeland's small room. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol was located near Jones's body. No notes were left. To the crime scene examiners, it was apparent that Jones had shot Copeland and then turned the gun on himself. The police ultimately determined that Jones's depression over his breakup with Copeland in October had led to the murder-suicide. Jones and Copeland had met back in Ventura, where they lived previously. She was a gifted musician while he excelled at sports. They dated for a few months before going their separate ways. To those who knew Jones, his actions took them completely by surprise. Even his 17-year-old sister, for whom he was close, was at a loss to explain her brother's actions. Not long after this terrible tragedy, people residing in the Mary Ward Hall began hearing strange sounds coming from the third-floor room. Faint voices, eerie knocking, and sometimes the sound of a gun being fired. In her article, Bodestein spoke with English major Stephen Tyndall, who lived across the hall from Adam in the dorm. He claimed that he heard something bizarre one evening that he couldn't explain. It sounded like there were people in our room once around 3 or 4 a.m., but when I opened the door, there was nothing there. I also heard knocking on the inside once or twice, he told Bodestein. 18-year-old Melissa Covert had heard about the hauntings on Facebook before moving into Mary Park Hall. I started reading more into supernatural things and bought my own Ouija board in my freshman year of high school. I really want to go to the third floor of Mary Ward because I heard it's haunted, she told Bodestein. Covert and a friend did manage to gather enough courage to take their Ouija board to the third floor of Mary Ward Hall, but received no responses. They were eventually asked to leave the third floor because officials thought their activity was scaring the residents. Is it possible that the ghosts of Catherine Ann Copeland and Eric Michael Jones still haunt the dorm room where they died? Are the voices overheard by Tyndall and others the couple arguing from somewhere else? Or is it merely that horrible night replaying over and over in a sort of tragic perpetual loop? As some paranormal researchers believe that a tragedy, in this case the death of two young people, can imprint itself on the surroundings, creating a sort of endless loop that plays out forever. Granted, it could be something else altogether, and since I'm no expert either way, I'll just let you guys make up your own minds about it. While haunted dorm rooms can be a tad off-putting, maybe even a little frightening, it is nothing compared to what a certain witness encountered while driving to work in Melbourne, Australia. This encounter, or at least the being described by the witness, is certainly unique. If true, this entity ranks as one of the strangest ever catalogued. Tuesday, February 8, 2016, a person living in Melbourne, Australia, on the beautiful Mornington Peninsula, left for work at around 8 a.m. The witness remembered that it was hot and sunny that morning, and they decided to take a different route to work than the one they usually took. They needed to make a pit stop at a local supermarket to pick up some food for their lunch. When they were done, they left the shop and jumped back into their car. They hastily made their way through some back streets and was approaching a small Anglican church, which sat on their left-hand side of the street. This is when things got strange. As a person drew closer to the building, they suddenly observed a, quote, very tall black thing, unquote, emerge from the church entrance and quickly dart across the grass on the church grounds, heading towards the road. Quote, my instinct was to slow down as I expected it to cross in front of my car. I watched it move very quickly, taking long, strange strides across the grass. It reached the end of the church grounds, about to step onto the road, and then just vanished into thin air, unquote. The witness described the thing as very tall and thin, with a small head, jet black, and with no noticeable features. Also, it had no arms that they could recall, but that wasn't the weirdest part. Quote, as I was driving away in shock, all I could think was, what the heck was that thing with the scissor legs? It then dawned on me that it had no knees and was moving very quickly with straight scissor-like legs, if that makes any sense, unquote. The entity the witness observed was essentially a giant pair of black scissors walking in broad daylight. Completely confused as to what the thing was and where it went, the driver continued to stare into their rear view as they lurched up the road. About a minute after the sighting, the witness began to feel nauseous to the point where they thought they were going to have to pull over and vomit. Quote, I have had a few experiences in my life that made me feel very nervous and uneasy, but nothing has ever made me feel like I want to be physically sick before. Thankfully, the sick feeling passed as I got further away, unquote. Not surprisingly, the witness could not stop thinking about what they had seen for some time afterwards. They wondered if what they'd encountered was a type of ghost in strange form or something else. It's interesting that the witness encountered this entity dashing away from a church. I'm curious what role the church played in the encounter. Further, I'd like to know the history of the church and if it's home to ghostly activity. Another thing of interest is the strange sickly feeling described by the witness. It is not uncommon for people to experience nausea after an encounter with strange entities. Anyone who reads about encounters involving dogmen or black-eyed kids or even some of the more peculiar aliens, most notably the Flatwoods Monster, will have heard of this sick feeling before. The witness does not indicate that they felt fear in its presence, just wonderment. Interesting, a church would play a role in another very weird case, this one from Liverpool, one involving a missing girl, a witch-like woman, some very strange people, and a man in black. Noted UK-based Fortean researcher and prolific author Tom Slemen would bring the case to the public's attention, although other investigators would look into it as well. If you want to hear a really good rundown of this case, I'd suggest you go over to Tom Slemen's website or go to his YouTube channel and watch his video presentation of this case. It's a lot better than I can do, and he really lays it out really well, gives you an idea of what happened. I kind of wanted to just run through it really quick so I can talk about some of the stuff that has happened since. He released the story in his book, Haunted Liverpool 4. I kind of wanted to talk about some of the stuff that has come to light since then. With regards to what happened on the grounds and with what happened inside the church that wasn't revealed in his book. And I'm pretty sure some of you guys have heard this story before, because it's been in other authors' books. They've talked about this case. But I thought it was really interesting, and I kind of wanted to run through it really quick and then just, like I said, go over some of the stuff that's happened afterwards. So, Friday, December 20th, 1991, 7 p.m. The Edwards family of Dovecot set out to do some Christmas shopping in Liverpool city centre. Mr. Edwards drove his wife and 4 kids to town. Mr. Edwards drove around looking for a parking spot his 3 sons and daughter took in the Christmas lights lying in the streets. The youngest of the Edwards children was Abby, who was 6 years old. The mother pointed out a secluded side street called Bull Place, which runs from Berry Street past the back of St. Luke's Church up to Roscoe Street. The father pulled in and parked. Family filed out and began discussing where to go first. After a few minutes, they set off. That's when the father made a shocking discovery. Abby was gone. The family immediately checked the car in a nearby street, but found nothing. Suddenly, off in the distance came a faint voice. It sounded like Abby. She was screaming, "Daddy!" It seemed to be coming from Bowl Place towards Roscoe Street. They charged off in that direction. The gates at the back of St. Luke's were open, and Mr. Edwards guessed that his daughter had wandered into the grounds of the old church. They rushed inside, and once again, all they heard was Abby crying for her father. Strangely, the little girl was nowhere to be seen. Adding to their panic was the fact that a heavy fog had rolled into the area, and it was making it hard to see. Mr. Edwards worried that some sicko had taken Abby inside the ruins of the old church. He handed his wife the keys and told her to go retrieve the flashlight from the car. When she returned, he had climbed up onto the ledge of a church window, and using the flashlight, he peered inside. Aside from the usual rubble, there was no sign of Abby. St. Luke's Church had been leveled by an incendiary bomb on May 5, 1941 in World War II. The building, now merely a shell, was left as a reminder of the war. Strangely, though, they could still hear Abby's cries for help, as well as a faint, eerie sound of a church organ. It was all becoming increasingly strange, and Mr. Edwards felt it was time to go to the police. They rushed to the police station on Hope Street, and within minutes, officers and cars had arrived on Bold Street to help with the search. After about 20 minutes, with no luck, something very strange happened. A tall man wearing a top hat and a long black coat came walking towards them from inside the grounds of St. Luke's. Holding his hand was little Abby. She raced to them after seeing them. With Abby firmly in her father's grasp, the family studied the man who returned her. To them he looked sinister, like something out of a Victorian era. He had long bushy sideburns, a pale gaunt face, and ink-black eyes. He stood outside the gates of the church, and in a low voice the man said, "Please accept my sincere apology for any distress caused." He then turned and walked silently back towards the rear of the church ruins through a door. Mr. Edwards called after him, but there was no response. A police car soon appeared, and the family informed them that Abby had been returned by a strange man, who had retreated back into the ruins. The police rushed in to apprehend him, but they were unable to find the door, which had been walled up with brick. During their inspection of the grounds, the officer claimed that they heard faint strains of a church organ playing nearby somewhere, but they never determined just where the music was coming from. When asked by a police officer what happened, Abby told a very strange story. She claimed that after getting out of the car, an old woman, whom Abby described as, quote, looking like a witch, unquote, in a shawl, and grabbed her hand and dragged her into the suddenly intact church where a mass was being held. She claimed in the church there were many people dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The women wore big hats and the men were all dressed in black. Speaking with Liverpool Echo in December 2012, Slemen mentioned some things not present in his article on the case, which was published in his book Haunted Liverpool 4. Slemen claimed that Abby saw other terrified children dressed in modern clothes in the church that night, hinting at other possible abductions. She also observed a hooded man in black doing handstands and carrying out what seemed to be a mocking parody of the Christian Mass on an altar. Abby had screamed for her father, but the old woman had placed her bony-fingered hand over her mouth to shut her up. Sometime later, a tall man came into the church through a door, approached the old woman, and pulled Abby away from her. He led her outside to her parents. The officer asked if the fellow had spoken to her at all. The man said he had been a long time dead. That's all, she told him. This comment would send a chill up everybody's spine. Following this event, no member of the Edwards family would venture anywhere near St. Luke's Church. Author John Raplin, in his book 800 Years of Haunted Liverpool, wondered if Abby had been involved in a type of time slip event, noting that similar time slips were said to have occurred on nearby Polk Street. Speaking to Liverpool Echo, Tom Slemen noted other strange events at the church. Quote, I have reports dating from the 1950s of ghostly, shadowy figures being seen in the grounds and interior of the former church, and of strange chanting sounds and eerie organ music being heard in the vicinity of the ruin. Too many people have seen too many unfathomable things for it all to be in the mind, and these witnesses range from people passing St. Luke's on their way to work during dark winter mornings to police and even prostitutes who have encountered a recurring sinister figure time and time again. A tall man in black who wears a top hat. He has ink-black eyes, and his height is estimated to be at least 6 feet 5 inches, unquote. One of the most disturbing encounters with the top-hatted man in black occurred in the late 1980s. According to Slemen, a 19-year-old student named Hattie had left a bar on Hardman Street to walk home. Heavily inebriated, she had collapsed near the gates of St. Luke's. Hattie's friend Jenny also left the bar and was trailing close behind. As Jenny approached the gates of St. Luke's, she observed a tall silhouette of a man pick Hattie up and walk off into the mist towards the church grounds. Jenny became frantic, alerting a nearby policeman who was on his beat about the incident. The constable immediately entered the grounds of St. Luke's in search of the abducted girl and noticed lights in the windows of the derelict church. The policeman soon spotted a tall man who looked as if he was in fancy dress and makeup because he wore a top hat, a long black coat, and his eyes were black with no white in them. In his arms he held an unconscious teenage girl. 3 times the policeman ordered the stranger to put the girl down. The strange figure merely stared at him, unmoving, and then suddenly he dropped Hattie onto the grass. According to the officer, the man then seemed to float steadily away into the depths of the fog and vanished. Just what the black-eyed man intended to do with Hattie is a mystery, as is the identity of the apparition.